Welcome to City Minutes, where we discuss new research that helps us understand the UK's largest cities and towns and policy ideas to improve their economic performance. I'm your host, Andrew Carter from the think tank Centre for Cities. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to this episode of City Minutes. Today I'm joined by my colleagues Caitlin Rollison and Zoe Johnson. They are the co-authors of our latest report, Around the World, How Do Visitor Levies Work in Other Countries? I'm sure all of our listeners know that on the 18th of February, the consultation ended for introducing or allowing some of our metro mayors to introduce visitor levies, a common thing in many other countries, a unique thing in England at least. So we're going to explore what they are and to the extent to which they differ or are similar in other countries across the globe. So, Caitlin, kick us off. Tell us a little bit more about the briefing, why we did it, what the structure was, the kind of things that we were looking at.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. So as Andrew mentioned, on the 18th, the government closed its consultation on introducing a visitor levy in England. And it's important to note that this applies to England only because Scotland and Wales already have visitor levies in place, which was something we helped touch on, I think, in this discussion, and we touched a lot on in the research. But for those of you who don't care as much about government consultation deadlines as perhaps we do, a lot of other reasons why we have done this work and why you should care about a visitor levy as well. And the first of those is that in England, a visitor levy would represent an initial step towards fiscal devolution. So when we are thinking about the introduction of a visitor levy, it's kind of setting a precedent for perhaps the future path for fiscal devolution in England. And it also sets a precedent for allowing mayors to grow their tax base and giving the mayors an incentive to grow their local economies in order to feed into that tax base. So it is essentially changing the fundamental powers and avenues for growth available to mayors. So obviously that's a much bigger change than something that perhaps on the surface seems like very much a concern for people involved in tourism or the visitor economy. And we chose to do this piece of work not just to feed into the consultation, but because we have previously addressed the core design of visitor levies. And that refers to, as I said, those Welsh and Scottish models, where you have either a flat rate or a percentage rate visitor levy. And in that, we found that the percentage rate offers by far the best incentive for mayors to grow their local economies. It's also the more progressive visitor levy. It is fairer for visitors and for businesses in the areas that choose to opt it. But this piece of work addresses a much broader set of core considerations that the government, metro mayors, and anywhere else that may be able to introduce a visitor levy will need to think about. Those are things like revenue flows, exemptions, and how revenues are used. And the core takeaway from this whole piece of work is that there is a huge variety of models out there for visitor levies, and that's partly driven by the fact that it really is kind of England alone almost that is not operating visitor levies. You have an incredible range of places around the world operating this system of levy, and that ranges from your big well-known tourist destinations like Barcelona and Amsterdam to much smaller places where these levies play a different role, places like SN or London, Ontario, not London, UK, or the city of Kito, Kyushu in Japan, not classically well-known tourist destinations. But the key takeaway from all places, big and small, is that levies need to be designed to match local aims.
Great, thank you very much, Caitlin. So reasonably new to Scotland and to Wales, but not new at all to many other countries and cities around the globe, which is what we wanted to look at. So Zoe, a variety of models are out there already. Take us through a little bit more of the variety. And I think we're going to highlight sort of three particular aspects of how these models either vary or actually look a little bit like each other. So just take us through the first of the issues that we want to highlight.
Yeah, so the three main areas that we looked at to differentiate different models were revenue flows first, exemptions second, and hypothecation of funds third. In terms of revenue flows, I think the most important takeaway from our research is that rarely and only in the most exceptional circumstances did we observe the upwards remittance of the tax from a local level of government to a higher level of government. So 3 points here. First, In most places, the local jurisdictions, that could be the town, the municipality, sets levies and collects the tax, keeps it all for themselves. So we see this in cities across Portugal, Ontario, Germany, and the Netherlands. 2, occasionally, we see a parallel tax being levied, so 2 taxes, one by a subnational or regional government, and then also one by the local authority, and these exist at the same time. Sometimes that subnational or regional authority collects all of the tax and then through a legal contract with the municipality will remit their portion. So that happens in Barcelona, in Paris. And then 3, on these very rare examples, we see local tax being collected at a local level, then flowing later on to a higher level government. This is not a model we really think is standard or best practice. I mentioned again, these are only in the few and exceptional circumstances. For example, around some of the cities and towns surrounding Milan for the Olympics, some of that local revenue generation from a very specific event is being shared with national government.
Okay, so that's who collects and who gets to spend. That's the one issue that we wanted to look at. The second one was around exemptions, who does or who doesn't pay as it is. Caitlin, just give us some headlines on that.
Yeah, so when we looked at exemptions, it was, I think, very useful for the government and for places in England who might be introducing these levies to see that there is a fairly broad degree of consistency, whether it's Japan to Canada to the Netherlands, in the kinds of exemptions that you have to begin with. Those are what you would typically expect. So, for example, most places operate exemptions for groups such as asylum seekers, other vulnerable populations like people in temporary housing situations, homeless people, anyone on low incomes, perhaps people receiving specifically defined sets of benefits. So you have those core groups. After that, you see a lot of variation in exemptions, but these are kind of 1 or 2 specific exemptions added by every place. And again, just like a visitor levy needs to match local aims, these exemptions are added by places which typically have local autonomy to do this over very specific cases. So for example, New York has an exemption for members of the United Nations. It's very unlikely that, for example, Greater Manchester would need to add this exemption.
You never know. You never know. Ambitious Greater Manchester it is.
Yeah, we hope to see that day. When you look at other places, for example, Lisbon has an exemption for short-term accommodation for students and international students. I think it was for the first 60 days. And that is very likely to reflect the fact that it have a high student population. People come in, they're looking for permanent accommodation. They're not tourists. They're going to be there on a long-term basis, but they need that short-term accommodation in order to get themselves set up. And the city has made a decision that that group should be exempted. And I think the important, coming back to that kind of local aims and local autonomy, the important takeaway here is that metro mayors and anywhere else in England getting these powers should be able to decide those kind of limited specific exemptions by themselves. But of course, at the back of their minds, they should always remember that the more exemptions you add, firstly, the smaller your tax base is going to be. And secondly, the more difficult it is going to be to administer your visitor levy. And I should really stress that second point, because when we looked at the examples, you see an incredible amount of complexity. There is almost infinite complexity that can be added to it. And that is something that places definitely want to avoid.
Very good. Trade-offs are everywhere. So that's who pays. Zoe, come back in on the third variable, which is about what is the money collected, what it gets spent on, and the degree to which there is direction or non-direction in how that money is allocated.
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting questions to explore, just because everyone wants to know what they get to do with money. And we found 3 different approaches, or classified them in 3 ways. No hypothecation. So these are the handful of cities and towns which have no statutory authority or responsibility to direct any of the revenue into anything specific. So for example, in Barcelona, the surcharge that they collect on tourist accommodation gets absorbed completely into the municipal budget. Same thing happens in Amsterdam. Secondly, there is hard hypothecation. This was a very rare instance. This is when basically 100% of the revenue has to be put towards some sort of Tourist Management Industry Association for the direct promotion of the tourism industry. But thirdly, and most importantly, the most common approach we saw was what we're calling soft hypothecation. And what that means is that either some fraction is supposed to be directed towards a tourism entity, some but not all, or it is very loosely defined. So the money must be put towards things that support the visitor economy. This is soft in our minds because there is a lot of overlap between the visitor and the general local economy. So, clean, nice public realms, bustling high streets, good transit connection. Those are things that improve a visitor experience, but also improve local experience. And importantly, what we found is that when mayors are empowered to invest locally at their discretion, there's a really strong incentive for growth. So growing the visitor economy directly translates to growing the local tax base, which provides more opportunities to invest in public infrastructure. And here I just want to give one example from the near north in Ontario, a small town called Huntsville, which people probably have never heard of and will never go to. Huntsville has about 20,000 people, but it has a very popular seasonal kind of cottage industry. And with the over $1 million that it raises in Canadian currency per year, it splits that between things that have to go towards the visitor economy, but this is broad. Again, a local curling rink, Pride, Muskoka Pride, Cottage Country Pride in the summer. But then also, very importantly, what it does with the remainder, that other 50% that it can use at its discretion, is really important. So from our research, we found, for example, that $300,000 was invested by the town of Muskoka into a physician recruitment program, because it's very hard for that specific town to retain and recruit physicians in their area. And so I think that just shows the wealth of different opportunities that are provided when local leaders are given discretion over local tax revenue.
Fantastic. If more of our metro mayors, all of our metro mayors, use some of their revenue to introduce curling rinks, I'd be in favour of that. Maybe we do better at the next Winter Olympics in that particular sport as well. So there's a kind of double win all on that. So there is a fair bit of consistency across the different examples. Obviously, there's quite a lot of variation as well. I would say, before we get a summary of what we'd like to see happen from Caitlin, is that those three issues, lots more detail obviously in the briefing, those three issues are particularly relevant to the nature of the debate that is going on in England about the visitor levy as it is. Who gets to raise that money and do they keep it? Who gets exempted from that, both individuals and institutions, however defined, and then what that money gets spent on. If you look at the debate, that is often where it is central to what's going on. And you say you can get lots more detail in the briefing itself. But Caitlin, just give us a summary of what we'd like to see happen. Doesn't mean this is going to happen, but what we would like to see happen.
Yes. So I think the first thing that hopefully should be evident to everyone listening by now is that we at Centre for Cities would like to see the government continue with its agenda to introduce a visitor levy and to give this power to mayors and possibly also to foundation strategic authorities as they set out in their consultation. And that is because giving these powers to the mayors will represent a first step towards fiscal devolution, and it will give mayors the power to raise that local revenue that can then go into all of the kind of examples that Zoe provided and examples like what Barcelona does, where it's also funding kind of much bigger economic development strategies. And we would also like to see, and you see this in the examples that we've talked about and in the kind of three key takeaways on revenue, exemptions and hypothecation, that yes, you have core consistency between places, but you also need mayors as the introducers of visitor levies. And as set out in the government's consultation, the people who know their places best, a level of local autonomy for them to be able to tailor those visitor levies to what is needed, whether that's perhaps addressing some concerns around over-tourism or seasonal peaks, which I think is a big consideration for places like Edinburgh, Barcelona, when they brought in theirs, to really starting to grow kind of fledgling visitor economies and getting perhaps a small but really important amount of revenue into that local visitor economy and to the local economy more broadly. And I think just to bring it back to kind of what I touched on opening, One other important thing to note is that it is the percentage model ultimately that better supports all of these aims. It allows more flexibility. It is more progressive in terms of not penalizing places that perhaps have a smaller visitor economy or a less affluent visitor population. And it removes some of the complication around whether you need to vary that tax and how many exemptions you need to set and all of those things. And giving mayors that tool will be kind of the clearest and best way for them to achieve the government's aims of supporting them to grow their economies, and indeed those mayors' aims of growing their local economy.
Very good. Thank you for that summary. Yeah, big picture kind of message takeaway for those listening from government. Visitor levies may feel special in England or indeed in the UK, but they're not special. They're normal pretty much everywhere else. That should give us confidence, and relate to that confidence. Please do take this forward. There will be people and institutions that will push back on it, but actually we should make progress and introduce them as quickly as we can so the Metro Mayors begin their journey towards more fiscal devolution, more fiscal autonomy. So thanks for listening. You can get much more detail in the report, in the briefing itself. It's called Around the World, How do Visitor Levies Work in Other Countries? Please have a look. Give us the feedback. If you've got additional examples, additional detail we should take a look at, we would love to hear from you. Thanks to Caitlin and to Zoe. And thanks to you for listening. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to this episode of City Minutes, brought to you by the Centre for Cities. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Podbean by searching Centre for Cities. Please rate and subscribe if you like what you heard. Centre for Cities is an independent think tank dedicated to improving the economies of UK's largest cities and towns. You can follow the Centre on Twitter at Centre for Cities, all one word, or on LinkedIn for the latest on what the Centre is up to. To hear all about our latest reports and briefings and upcoming events, sign up to our fortnightly newsletter via our website, centreforcities.org. If you'd like to get in touch, do tweet us or send an email to info@centreforcities.org.